What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. So I'm gonna give you a 5-minute rundown of the Canon C100 Mark II in 2022. And I've been waiting to do this video. I've seen tons of videos of a review of the C100 in 2019, 2018, 2020, 2021. Is it still a valuable camera option? I will say yes. And I'm gonna give you some details without going into all the specs of it. I'm gonna go into some highlights. It is a super 35mm sensor. It has built-in ND filters up to 6 stops. It has 2 XLR inputs. It has a top handle with a shotgun mic. It has an LCD viewfinder. It's a 1080p output, but it downsamples from a 4K sensor, so the image quality from the C100 Mark II is going to be way sharper than the older DSLRs. You know, when you had a 5D Mark III and it's like, oh, that did 1080p. No, it's not the same quality as the C100 Mark II. It's a true cinema camera, which is going to give you a less digital image, and it's a very pleasing image. And when you accompany that with the professional tools like zebras, waveforms, peaking, this is something that gets your feet wet into the cinema market. Now, the camera as of right now, I think is listed at about $2,200. I would recommend buying it used for $1,200 to $1,500. I sold mine in 2020 for like $2,000. Upgraded to the C200, but then eventually I have the Canon C70 right now. I don't own the C100 Mark II right now, but pretty much it'll be a similar size, different ergonomics, but a similar size. And ultimately, when you look at a setup like this is the reason why I got the C70, because I was always looking for the next version of the C100 Mark II. You know, and what I loved about the C100 Mark II is that, one, it was a bigger size than, you know, my 5D Mark III. This is the R6, but the 5Ds are about a similar size as the R6. So if I showed up for client work with this, if clients don't know specs, they will look at this and look at the C100 Mark II, even this R6, they would say, I want him to shoot with the C100 Mark II, even though this is a superior image quality. So keep in mind, when I was showing up with the C100 Mark II, people was hiring me thinking I'm bringing a camera that's $20,000. And technically, it was a $20,000 camera because the C300 Mark I, the C500 Mark I used the same sensor, and those were all $20,000 cameras, and the C100 Mark II had a little bit more. The C300 and C500, the only thing it had over the C100 Mark II is that it did 422 8-bit internally, but if you hooked up something like an Atomos Ninja Recorder or a Ninja Flame or whatever Atomos at the time was available, you got 422 8-bit externally in ProRes at a higher bit rate than what you're going to get internally from a C300 or C500. I thought it was 10-bit. Someone corrected me, said it was 8-bit, but 422 8-bit is still phenomenal at ProRes out of that camera for that price range at $5,500, I believe, when I bought the camera. And ultimately, it did everything I needed to do. I was able to pair it with this Sigma 18-35, which most C100 Mark II users use, and you're able to shoot at a 1.8. Now, ideally, I always shot at like a 2.8 to give me a really shallow depth of field and still maintain some of the image quality by not being fully wide open. And with the ND filters built in the camera, it always stood out a little differently than when I was shooting with a 5D Mark III or some other, you know, DSLRs at the time. And a lot of people are like, well, you can get a GH5 or all these other different things, but there's some advantages of a cinema camera. One, how people see you, perception to your client work, because it's a little heavier. You know, when you're holding a cinema camera, it's easy to stabilize, even though, you know, just think of this as a 5D, because the R6 actually has IBIS built in, you know, image stabilization up to 5 stops. But if this didn't have that, you know, because you're moving and you're moving shots, it's gonna, you know, be a little bit more jittery versus a cinema camera, because that weight is coming down. All I have to do is kind of push up and get a more smoother shot in transition. And that's something that a lot of times people don't really take into consideration when they first making a jump to a cinema camera, as well as the other added options as peaking and zebras to really nail down exposure. Exclusively, I use force color right now, and I'm not sure if the C100 has it, but you can hook up the external monitor, as mentioned before, with the Atomos and get the force color to really nail down exposure. C100 also introduced dual pixel autofocus. It was the first Canon cinema camera with that, and that came in handy when you was running gunning and you didn't know if, you know, you was locked in for critical focus. Now, depending on the situation, if someone was a little jumpy, I wouldn't really use the dual pixel autofocus, just because it's not face tracking. No matter where I move, my C500 is gonna lock in on me right now. So if the client was moving a lot, then it might back it might back hunt, which is an annoying thing. You can't get rid of it. You can't cut around it unless you was doing 2 angles, you know. So, but if it's a set target, you put in dual pixel autofocus, which was center focus, and it always nailed down, you know, the focus for me, which was very, very valuable. And there were some lenses out, STM Canon EFS lenses that can lock down, you know, face tracking, but I never really used it because the image quality wasn't as good as the L series lenses or the Sigma Art lenses I mainly used with the Canon C100 Mark II. And just for some pushback for some people watching it, like, well, the C100 is not Netflix approved, keep in mind, there are a ton of projects on Netflix shot on the C100 Mark II. You only need to meet the requirements if Netflix is hiring you, and at that point you probably have a crew or you have the gear that you purchased off the money you made having that, you know, contract with Netflix. That is not going to be a problem. But you can still shoot documentaries, movies, and projects and sell it to Netflix or have it distributed on Netflix and then put it on a platform even if it doesn't meet their 4K requirements. You don't need that. So just kind of keep that in mind when people throw that out there. But ultimately, even in 2022, the C100 Mark II is something I think stand the course of time. This is a camera that came out in 2014. It has a cinema look, you know, so it's not the sharpest camera in the world, but remember, sharp cameras is not always the thing that you want for film and corporate, because, you know, it really exposes the skin. A lot of times, even on my C500 Mark II right now, I have a black Pro Mist filter on there to kind of take out some of the digital feeling to it, to give it a nice little cinematic, you know, look to it, to really, you know, do something with the highlights a little bit differently. And on a lot of film sets where they shoot with ARRI and Red, they do that. They actually want to make digital cameras look less digital and more cinematic. You know, ARRI is the reason why it's the king of the ship, because it looks closest to film. Red is the second closest, and then it's a free-for-all argument whether you're talking Canon, Sony, Blackmagic, whatever it is. It's just a lot of great cameras being made, which I love and I appreciate because it keeps the camera prices down. So with that said, a C100 Mark II for $1,200 to $1,500. XLR inputs, built-in ND filters, you know, professional tools is a great, valuable option in 2022 to get your camera career started, your freelancing career started. All the gear I have now, 95% of the gear I own right now is generated from the income I made off of the Canon C100 Mark II. So just keep that in mind. The bang for the buck was remarkable. And ultimately, I hope this video was helpful, educational. If you got questions about the C100 Mark II, you know, feel free to comment down below so I can get feedback. Or if you got perspective, I would love to incorporate that if I do a follow-up video. And if you do have a little bit more funds and you want to think of something like the Canon C70, highly recommend it. What I would say is the C100, mastering the C100 makes the learning curve for the C70, the C500 Mark II I'm shooting on right now so simple, so easy. You know, it's just more options. This is 4K, a DGO sensor, and that's more internal in specs. That has nothing to do with the ergonomics and how you shoot. You know, it just makes, you know, shooting a little bit more easy and your image a little bit better. But the C100 is going to be the greatest, you know, foundation of a cinematic camera school at that price range as of right now. You know, and if you want to go with a DSLR or something mirrorless like a R6, feel free. You know, I love this camera. This is the one I always travel and keep with me, and the C70 always comes with me as well if I'm doing a big corporate shoot, because I have the C500 in a matte box and so many other things hooked up to it. You know, it's that camera that I want to impress the clients with, so they could be like, I understand why I'm paying my money. So that's how I kind of use it. But the C100 can kind of give you the same exposure, the same setup. People was always impressed with that camera. And ultimately, there's no such thing as a perfect camera. What is the perfect camera for your situation, for your project, for your story, for your budget? Focus on story, focus on composition, get that meaning and that purpose out there, and the people are going to connect to you. And if you make the funds to think about other options, by all means do so. You know, find the thing that makes your efficiency and your workflow the best. And hopefully this was helpful, educational. There's links in the description box below. Feel free to click on them. I do get a commission for some of the links. You know, that helps support this channel. It helps me recover from mistakes and purchases that I made, so you don't have to make the same mistakes. Of course, you know, additional charge. You know, it's just, you know, sewing back into the community. So as always, stay creative, be courageous, and get on your grind.